12-Step Buddhist podcast number 20, episode 20. So for today, let's see, I'm working on the iPad for this one. It has a bigger screen, so should be, we'll see. So at any rate, what was I saying? The topic for today is Dr. Jimmy Marich, Trauma and the 12 Steps. So she has some really interesting things to say. And it's one of the people in the field that I like to associate with, among a few others who are interested in some of the same things that I'm working with and writing about and so forth. I apologize. There are a couple of small glitches at the very beginning, I think due to the Wi-Fi connection. Not so sure, but you'll get the gist. You're not really missing anything critical. So take a listen, check it out. I wanted to mention Hither and Yon. That's Hither and Yon, hitherandyon.com. They are the place where I get all of my Tibetan incense. You can hear the jet coming. I've moved to San Diego and now I'm in the flight path. So here it comes, at any rate. Hitherandyon.com. The guy's really nice. He lives in Hawaii and he's got the amazing selection of excellent prices of Tibetan incense, which is all I use, and I use it all day, every day. So it's a really cool spot to check out. Tell them I sent you, and you'll probably get some samples and goodies. So at any rate, here's Jamie and this awesome talk about these topics related to addiction and recovery. So I hope you enjoy it. We do have the 12-Step Buddhist webinar with Beyond Words Publishing on December 4th at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's free. I'm also doing some live meditations. I'm doing one of those tomorrow, but you might not get this webcast in time. So you can just check the 12stepbuddhist.com for those, because I'm going to have those posted with a live link that you can just open YouTube and tune right in. So you can always hit me up and let me know what your availability is, and we'll just try to go at times when people are more available. But I'm in San Diego now and I'm working on setting things up, so if you're around this area, holler. Let me know where you're at and what's up. We do have the 12-Step Yogi / Y12SR meditation meeting and yoga class here in San Diego on Saturdays at the Taoist Sanctuary at 7 p.m. So let me know if you need details on that. In the meantime, let's get on with the show. It's a really, really, really big show. Hey everybody, Darren Littlejohn here with Jamie Marich, Dr. Jamie Marich, author of Trauma and the 12 Steps, a complete guide to enhancing recovery. Jamie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Darren.
So, I found your book a little while ago. I think it was probably when it first came out, maybe over a year ago, right? When did this come out?
July 12, so a little over a year ago.
A little bit over, yeah. So I took a look at this and I thought, wow, this was really something that I'm interested in. And I started looking into trauma and been studying about trauma for the past couple of years. And one thing that I noticed right away in your work is that, and we've even got a chapter on it here, and we want to talk about a little bit about what your background is and what you're doing, but you had sent me your book, and I started reading this section where 12-step recovery can and often does go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the 12-Step Buddhist, I have a chapter called 12-Step, something like 12-Step Programs, What Works and What Doesn't. So you know that we're a little bit on the same page there. And this is a little bit sacrilege within the 12-step community, right?
Sure. Yep.
For example, I just went to a meeting last night here in San Diego called the Big Book Awakening. And they're a really great, energetic kind of group, very enthusiastic and so forth, but they sort of seem to, I don't want to say proselytize, but they sort of nothing else. So what would your reaction to that be?
Well, I think that's an example of where AA can go wrong because, and I'm very sensitive to that issue because I grew up in two really hardcore religious groups. My mother was a very devout Catholic. My father was a very devout evangelical. So and I know a lot of other people in recovery have real sensitivity to things being shoved down my throat. And a lot of what concerns me and what I mean by when meetings go wrong is, I think the 12-step program is fundamentally sound. It's what certain meetings do with it that concern me. Kind of like what you encountered last night, that it's our way or the highway. I think that could be triggering and activating for a lot of people and can push people away who might really benefit from a 12-step program.
Well, this is something that you and I have in common, which I'd like you to explain, to the people that are listening. Well, for one thing, as a member of 12-step programs for a few decades now, I've really noticed a lot of this sort of fundamentalist type thinking, and this is the reason why I do the work that I do, and I would venture to say that that's some of the motivation behind your work as well. So let's talk a little bit about what the overview is of addiction recovery, what is trauma, how does trauma play a role, and maybe then we can get into a little bit more detail of some of the stuff you talk about in the book in terms of how people are triggered and activated, and what does that mean, and what can we do about it?
I think one of the most fundamental things for us to understand about trauma is that it simply comes from the Greek word meaning wound. So many people hear trauma and they think it has to be PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so many people hear post-traumatic stress disorder and they automatically go to, combat or natural disasters or these big newsworthy events. But the reality is, if we're looking at trauma as emotional wounding, all of us have been traumatized on some level. True, some people more pervasively than others. Some people have been exposed to it more than others. But the reality is, if traumatic wounds go unhealed, that is where problems can result. The thing about unhealed traumatic wounds of any kind is they can kick up such distress at the body level. Trauma tends to get stored in this part of unresolved trauma tends to get stored in this part of the brain that plays out in the body. So when we have these real gut level experiences or this uncontrollable anxiety in our chest, that's been a result of, just unprocessed stuff. And for many of us very early in life, alcohol, drugs, other reinforcing behaviors is the immediate thing that can be turned to self-soothe all of that. So I even go as far as to say, for so many of us, using drugs and alcohol started as a noble pursuit because we wanted to feel better. And for so many of us, nobody was there to really help us heal. It's something I talk about all the time. One of the links is that, these 3 unwritten rules of the alcoholic home or the dysfunctional home: don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Those are breeding grounds for trauma remaining unresolved. Now, I'm a bit of a traditionalist because there's a lot of my trauma colleagues who go as far as to say, addiction's just a symptom of the trauma. So if we clear up, the trauma, then the addiction will go away. I don't think it's as simple as that. I still believe addiction's a disease. But I think it's a disease that can have various causes. Some people just got it because of genetic hardwiring. Some people have it because they've developed it as an exposure, as a way of numbing these emotional wounds. And for some of us, like I identify as this, it's both. I believe I have the hardwiring, I have the tolerance to develop the disease of addiction, but how so much of my drinking and drugging started was to just deal with this intense crap in my body that it just wouldn't heal.
Well, listen, before you go further, I just want to dive into the concept of disease for a moment. And I don't want to go too far off track of our topic, but I feel like it's really something that I've really been blown away by this idea in the DSM-4 of the difference between being dependent or an abuser or a dependent. And they did away with it in the DSM-5. And honestly, I think they did. I personally just feel that they did away with it for politically correct insurance billing reasons. I think the research is valid, and I want to get your opinion on that because honestly, when I've been in 12-step for all these years, I've come across so many people that I've superimposed and that other people have superimposed this, well, you wouldn't be here by accident. You must be one of us. And sometimes those people are not one of us. Given sufficient reason, they can stop even though they showed all of the symptoms of any other type of an addict. But at some point, they can actually give it up, and they don't need to do the 12 steps, and they don't need to, have a lifelong commitment to being a diseased person. But others of us, which are more like me, definitely, the worse things get, the worse my disease gets.
Sure.
And there's a difference between me and my brain and people who don't have that. So can you speak to that just a little bit and how it relates to trauma?
God, we only have half an hour.
Well, we can do another episode another time, but anything you might have to say, I think it is interesting.
Well, in terms of the new DSM distinction, I mean, my whole approach to diagnostic manuals is they're kind of things we have to deal with in the field. That it's developed by psychiatrists largely for billing purposes. And even as a professional clinician, I take them with a grain of salt. And my best approach for people is, how's this affecting you now? And what can we do to address it and whatnot? I mean, what you described, the old school distinction of abuse versus dependence, I mean, I have encountered and treated people, I think, who legitimately were not addicts, in our sense, but can develop abuse or just problematic, get in the way of life consumption following a trauma or a major life event that just causes some type of adaptation they can't deal with. I think such people, can warrant from treatment, can warrant and benefit from, short-term exposure to 12 steps. But, their brain may not have gone to the place where ours has gone to, where it's like there's no turning back. That is possible. One thing I do like about the new DSM distinction, that it is on more of a continuum. And I do think alcohol, disorder, or whatever they're calling it, substance disorder, that it can manifest in various degrees of severity. And a lot of that, factor is this, that there is such a thing as biologic predisposition. So, you and I could have gone through a similar trauma that someone else went through, and if they didn't have this hardwiring, sure, they may not as have easily, developed addiction. Could they develop abuse or some problematic use? Absolutely. But then it remains to be seen, how early does it get caught? And there's just so many things we need to evaluate with people on a case by case basis.
And it's not it's just not as cut and dried or as oversimplified as people who are.
Yeah, that's imperative to stress. It's not as black and white as a lot of people make it.
And this is the kind of deal. If you're looking for recovery, and they tell you, look, you got to do 12 step as an ongoing basis, and you go to 12 step and you don't have the resources. I mean, who knows? Maybe Obamacare is going to improve it. We won't get into that. But
sure,
if there are resources available, I think a lot of people would like to use them. And particularly, it would be interesting if those resources, if the providers were more educated about addiction than they have been, at least in my experience, across the board in general. Some are. But most people, I don't think, really can find the resources or maintain them. So what they're left with is what they hear in meetings. And what they hear in meetings is, in my experience, a dramatic oversimplification and a disservice. Sure. It's a disservice to the complexity of the individual and the disease and the treatment. How would you respond to that?
I agree very much so. And this is, one of the points I make in my book is that not all meetings are created equally. That seems to be a theme we're even coming back to in the interview. And I know in my local area, most meetings people would encounter are that oversimplification. One thing as recovering folks and as treatment providers, I think we need to know is where are meetings that have a little more attitude for flexibility that people can be sent to. And I also stress with people as well, developing one-on-one relationships within a 12-step program might be the better way to go for a lot of people. Because, if you're just going to meetings, you're hearing oversimplification. But like a point that I make in my book is, my first sponsor I had, she met me on such an individualized level that if I didn't have that sponsor, Darren, I don't know if I would have stuck around. I'll be honest about it, because anything that fundamentalist triggered me. And, I had such a sponsor who was able to walk me through a lot of issues that came up with what I was hearing. But you're exactly right. 12-step is the most widely available. And I think there's a reason for that. There must be something great about the program because it has stuck around and has flourished. But you're right. It does leave a lot of people who are in more of a gray area kind of befuddled when it comes to seeking recovery or help.
Well, there's more of these people. There's more of us, I should say, instead of saying these people, because I consider myself one of them, that do have what we would call problems other than your primary drug of choice, right?
Sure.
So I forget I've researched this, but I forget the actual stats. Is it 1 in 6 dual diagnosis among people that are in recovery, or what do you recall as the sort of the percentage of people that have addiction and an additional mental emotional disorder?
That's sounding about right. I think it might be even higher.
Yeah.
More like 1 in 4, 1 in 5. And I am more conversant in the statistics on trauma.
Yeah.
That of people with post-traumatic stress disorder, about 30% would meet abuse criteria, and an additional 35% would meet dependence criteria. So I tell anybody, who's still familiar with DSM-4 language, if you're seeing PTSD, more than half of people have a substance issue. And the thing with statistics we have to keep in mind, they're so imprecise, especially within addiction land, because if you look up, comorbidity between PTSD or trauma and addiction, it'll be like anywhere from 12 to 35%. And whenever you see a big range of numbers, it means we don't really know.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people underreport, a lot of centers underreport, or they don't know what they're reporting. For instance, there's like still 5 or 6 definitions in the field about what constitutes relapse. I could talk to 5 different treatment providers, and they all have different whacked out conceptions about what trauma is. So I tell people all the time, numbers are imprecise, but it's high. It's significant.
It's more significant than, without people like you doing this work and putting this stuff out there. It's more significant than we're really generally aware of. So this is why I appreciate your work, and why I continue to try to do this kind of work myself, even though it really is going upstream. You really do kind of. A lot of times people. I've felt ostracized in the 12-step community at times, because they're kind of like, "Oh, who the hell do you think you are? You're supposed to be just another drunk, just like us. What are you writing books for?
Right.
And there's only one book. It's the big book, and all that." And so, well. We've got to be a little bit above that and be willing to kind of bear the brunt of that for the greater good. So, good for us. But the point of trauma, let's talk a little bit about your definition of trauma and how it relates to addiction first, and then how it could relate to recovery and what we can do about it to be a little bit less harmful and more beneficial to each other.
Well, just to re-highlight, the best way to keep it simple, trauma means wound. Etymologically, that's all it means, physically or mentally. And unhealed wounds do manifest, unhealed emotional wounds manifest great distress at the body level. We have plenty of neuroscience at this point to back that up.
Right.
And this is why so many of these, just talk it out, just think it out interventions, even in mental health, don't really cut it anymore, because they're not dealing with this pervasive body level distress people experience. And that's one of the reasons why, substances and reinforcing behaviors are appealing. Another big link between trauma and addiction, I don't think we talk about enough, is that trauma could leave a person with a real diminished sense of future. Trauma can teach you messages like you're never going to amount to anything anyway, or my world is dangerous. And if you're operating with that as your guiding force, of course, instant gratification is going to seem appealing. I tell treatment providers and sponsors, one of the worst assumptions we could make is to assume everybody wants a better life. Because people with unresolved trauma may not know what the hell that means, or what that would even look like, especially people who've grown up in environments where all they've known is trauma. And then that can, bring on this why bother. Now, why this matters to recovery, and this is where, I'm very passionate about messages I do give to 12-steppers who will listen, because, as great and wonderful as 12-step meetings can be, we do alienate a lot of people. I mean, I've worked in treatment and as a counselor long enough to know that we alienate a lot of people who just feel triggered at meetings, who don't feel safe at meetings. And, as I referenced, if I didn't have a real trauma competent sponsor who got trauma and mental health, I don't know if I would have stayed around meetings or worked the steps because, just certain things that go on at meetings concern me, some predatory behavior.
Some. You're being kind of generous there.
Yeah. So we'll take that some out of there. The predatory behavior, the proselytizing, like you mentioned, this extreme, black and white thinking. It can be very triggering. And another thing that concerns me is, how should I call it, like forced working of a lot of the steps, because don't get me wrong, I think there's something to be said for gentle motivation and how's this working for you type of strategy. But pushing a person with unhealed trauma to do a fourth or a fifth step before they're ready can be something that's a big gauntlet, a big landmine. I think fourth and fifth step work for people, especially with pervasive unresolved trauma, really should be done with a professional. I go as far as to say that. And as a counselor, I've heard a lot of people's fifth steps that I would have been kind of nervous for somebody without trauma training to hear. So, I go into a lot of the other potential concerns that I have in the book, but my main message is if we as a recovery community can become more trauma competent, it can help us to be more flexible and tolerant, I believe ultimately more welcoming.
Well, I remember seeing a play once, maybe in the mid-'80s when I was first sober, where they were kind of doing some psychodrama where they're sort of like, without words, the newcomer would walk up to the sponsor and the sponsor would suddenly, puff their chest out and become sort of filled with this sort of apparently grandiosity or something. And they've adopted this new role. And, there are no rules. There are no regulatory committees. There's really no oversight. In other words, there's no stopping anybody from telling anybody else what anybody wants to believe. And when you go into meetings, a lot of times, I hear this. I don't know how many hundreds of emails I've gotten from people around the world who've read my books and stuff who are saying, hey, I really, I can't find a sponsor. Or if I find a sponsor, they're very this or that. There's some problem. They're not there for me. And so we're sort of like the blind leading the blind from a clinical point of view. We're kind of like the blind leading the blind. But then at the same token, there's that one drunk talking to another thing or one addict talking to another that really is irreplaceable.
Totally. Because there is there is a magic about that. There's no doubt about that, and that's even something Carl Jung, one of the great fathers of modern psychology, was attuned to. That something about one drunk helping another works. My big plea is I think we can be more compassionate about how we do it.
Sure, I think we can be. Yeah, I think everybody in recovery should read your book.
Oh,
and all clinicians should read it. And I wrote when I wrote the 12-Step Buddhist, I said in the beginning, this book is for clinicians, parents, friends, people in recovery. You have to be aware of what goes on and what the complexity of what goes on if you're going to be what we say in 12-Step to be of maximum service, right? So there's how we treat each other in recovery, and there's how clinicians can be aware of these issues, and then there's that piece that you've gone back to, and I know that you're involved in some movement therapy. I was recently trained last summer in the Y12SR Yoga 12-Step Recovery.
Nikki's program,
Nikki, and she got into a little bit of this, and I'm sort of reformulating it a little bit for my own 12-Step Yogi work. But there's so much power in healing. Now I just finished 12 years of therapy with the same clinician before I moved to San Diego. And in that 12 years, it's had its benefits. My 12-step program has had its benefits. But I'm telling you what, 3 solid years of kick-ass yoga work has done, I personally believe, more for me than anything else that I've done so far. Yeah. It really is powerful. So can you talk about how that works?
Sure. I mean, it goes back to unresolved trauma. It's stuck in the same part of the brain where these addiction processes happen.
Like Nikki says,
And
the issues live in the tissues.
live in our tissues, yeah. And so much of that desire to drink or use is because we want our bodies to feel better.
Right.
And the power of yoga and movement practice and exercise is that we're learning how to use our bodies in more adaptive, nourishing ways. Because you do a disservice when you take the body out. I mean, one thing, the more I practice yoga, the more I've connected the dots. That where a lot of traditional recovery treatment centers fall short is, it's very good working with the mind and the spirit. Maybe there's a gym or an exercise program, but there's no real concentrated efforts on teaching people how to read their body cues and use their bodies. And I know in my own personal recovery, when I had about 5 years sober, I started dabbling in yoga. 6 years sober, I really dove into it. And I just noticed such a complete turnaround in my own recovery. I now developed and facilitate a program called Dancing Mindfulness, which is one of these yoga dance practices. That's the larger genre. And I teach professionals how to do it so that they can use movement in their treatment centers or their clinical offices. I offer it in the community. That's actually where I'm headed right after this interview. We have a big event tonight. And I've noticed that a lot of recovering folks that I've just known from my own circles have been attracted to dancing mindfulness classes and our yoga studio. As one of my regular dancers says, I have 3 years sober. It's helped me tremendously, the program, but yoga and dance has really helped me connect with yet another dimension of my spirituality because I'm using my body. And that makes total sense that, the body's where it all starts. We drank because we wanted our bodies to feel better. And I do want to add, though, something I love about Nikki's work. I actually interviewed her for my new book that's coming out next year. I like how she says, just yoga alone is not going to cut it.
Right.
That for her, a combination of the yoga with the 12-step recovery was ultimately, what sustained her in her, current experience with recovery. And I believe that too. Because something I like that you hit on in the 12-step Buddhist is how in so many of these Buddhist circles, they don't get us. And what the addict goes through. Because even my dear business partner and collaborator, fabulous yoga teacher, we do a lot of retreats and work together. There's just some things about me she don't get. And that's why I'm glad I have a community now of people like you and Nikki and Kitsky and other people in my town who are even starting to think this way now, where we get both the conscious and the movement piece plus the recovery piece.
Well, and I've even noticed, somehow I've got to figure out how to get on the loop of some of these conferences that are going on, but I noticed there was one just in Florida last month that an addiction treatment professional conference that had a ton. Wait a minute, maybe you were speaking there, but there was so many topics that I found to be fascinating to even just see that people are talking about all of these different types of modalities.
And I was not at the one in Florida. I presented in Atlanta at NADAC this year because there's so many addiction treatment conferences. You can go to one every week, really, and so I have to pick and choose. But the thing I applaud NADAC, the Association for Addiction Professionals, they have supported me teaching dancing mindfulness there the last 2 years. They were super accommodating, gave me this big courtyard space in Atlanta, and all these recovering folks and professionals took part in it. And I really think there is a hunger in our field for people seeing that, just talking about our feelings is not enough.
Yeah, and, the way I've just, from my own sort of individual case study over these years, the multifaceted, comprehensive, multidimensional approach really is the only thing that can even, that can keep me around. And I've been around this a long time, and I've seen a lot of people fall and not be able to come back. So all of this work is, I think maybe we're just kind of scratching the surface. Would you agree on sort of a new era of treatment?
I think so, because I think for so many years we've given lip service to this idea of holistic treatment, but now so many people are catching on to what it really means, and that is you have to very dynamically use the body. Something I really owe my ex-husband a lot of credit to. He was an addiction doctor, and addictionologist. He ended up relapsing, and thank God he's back in recovery. But I remember when we first got together, he always used to say things like, you counselors are so afraid of the body. body. Like, you don't want to talk about the body. And of course, he meant more from the medication standpoint, and that, like, him as a medical doctor felt really excluded because counselors looked at doctors as the big bad guys. And I'm not even going to get into that whole issue of medications and over-medicating and how that goes on.
Right.
But I think fundamentally he was right, that a lot of counselors are afraid of the body, that, it's all about let's talk it out, let's think it out. And, I think we can't be afraid of the body because so much of these problems are happening with our body. Drinking is a body process. Compulsive sexuality is a body process. So we can't avoid working with people how to better listen to their bodies and work with healthy mechanisms. I tell clients, I tell people I train, your body tells you what's going on 10 steps before your head will. And I've believed that since I first got sober. And I know since I've really dove into yoga and movement practice, I believe that even more.
Well, I'm with you, and I think we could really talk a long time, and we should talk more. Two things. What's your next book about, and where can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, well, probably the best website of mine to visit is on this topic is www.trauma12.com. It's the number 12 spelled out. My main practice page is www.mindfulohio.com. And then the dancing mindfulness practice is just dancingmindfulness.com. My new book that's coming out is called Trauma Made Simple. Premier Education and Media is publishing it. They did my first book on EMDR. And really what this is a very I like to call it a human guide to trauma because it is written largely for a clinical audience, but trauma survivors can certainly benefit as well. But it talks a lot about let's just shed the bullshit and look that trauma needs addressed. People need to be healed, and I really approach it from that standpoint of trauma is the unhealed wound. So what do we as human beings know about wounding? I use a lot of case study in it, a lot of survivor perspectives, and we do cover a lot of the DSM updates about trauma. And then my other big project is we also have a dancing mindfulness home practice video coming out.
Oh, nice.
Literally here in the next 2 weeks, that should be ready. My goal was to release it here for the holiday season. And people could find me on Facebook. Dancing Mindfulness has a Facebook page. Trauma the 12 Steps has a Facebook page. I believe that's how we initially connected. And come and look me up there.
Well, yeah, fantastic. And hey, let's talk about another time. Let's talk about getting you down to Southern California to introduce some of this dancing mindfulness work. I'm going to be working on some ideas for conferences as we go forward.
Nice. I am actually in some preliminary talks to do a training in SoCal, so we'll make sure that, hopefully can happen. For any of your listeners, I'll be in Esalen in January, and all that'll be on the websites. They can find me and look all that up.
All right, fantastic. Well, I think we went a little bit over, but I think we could. We're already stopping short of what we could be talking about. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure we'll be in more conversations in the future.
Thank you, Darren. Cheers.
Cheers.